Welcome to this trip through one of the most disturbing cases in Georgia's history. Please leave a comment below to let me know where you are watching from and what time you are listening to this narration. We want to know where and when these documented accounts get to. In the fall of 1853, a small wooden cross was found on the edge of the Carwell plantation in Chatham County, Georgia, about 12 miles west of Savannah. The inscription on the base of the cross, "They are in the ground, but their souls feed the pigs," made this find stand out from others. A traveling merchant found it and told the local sheriff. 3 kids from the Carwell family were reported missing within 24 hours. What happened next was one of the most disturbing investigations in Antebellum, Georgia. Most of the details were not known until historian Miriam Holcomb found county records in 1962. The Carwell plantation was famous for its big crops of rice and cotton. The main house was on a small hill that looked out over rows of slave quarters and fields of crops that went all the way to the swamp. Thaddeus Carwell, a third-generation plantation owner whose grandfather built the estate in 1790, was in charge of the family. County records show that Carwell owned about 47 slaves. His wife, Margaret, and their 3 kids made up the family: Elizabeth, who was 12, Thomas, who was 9, and Sarah, who was 6. Eliza Brown was one of the housemaids and was about 36 years old. Sale records show that Thaddeus Carwell bought her 7 years ago from a nearby plantation after her previous owner died. Eliza was given the job of taking care of the Carwell kids and helping out in the kitchen. Accounts from other house servants written years later say that Eliza was known for her great cooking and her seemingly endless patience with the kids. Margaret Carwell wrote in her household journal that Eliza was very good at her job and very quiet. The household accounts did not mention the tension that ran through the Carwell home. Plantation owners in Chatham County knew Thaddeus Carwell as a strict disciplinarian. Several county records show that plantation owners in the area complained about how Carwell treated enslaved workers who had escaped to their properties. Local officials always turned down these complaints. Margaret Carwell wrote in her journal on the 14th of October, 1853, "The children have been especially hard today. Eliza seems to be less talkative than usual and more withdrawn. Thomas broke his father's reading glasses and has been stuck in his room. Elizabeth keeps complaining about stomach pains, but Dr. Whitfield can't find a reason. The air feels heavy, like a storm is coming." October 15th, the next day, was the last day anyone saw the 3 Carwell children alive. According to statements gathered months later, the day on the plantation started out like any other. Before dawn, the enslaved field workers left for the fields. Margaret Carwell spent the morning at a nearby plantation talking about plans for the harvest festival that was coming up. Thaddeus Carwell rode into Savannah for work and was not expected to come back until the next day. Eliza watched over the kids while they stayed at home. Elizabeth had been given a break from her studies because she kept complaining about stomach pain. Thomas was still being punished for what he did with his father's glasses. Eliza kept an eye on Sarah, the youngest, while she played in the nursery all morning. Samuel Johnson, another servant in the house, would later say that Eliza had been very busy in the kitchen that day, making a special meal for the kids. Johnson told investigators, "She said it was medicinal, something to settle Miss Elizabeth's stomach troubles. She wouldn't let anyone else near the cooking pot." By mid-afternoon, all 3 children had eaten the special meal that Eliza had made for them. By night, all 3 were sick with the same symptoms: drowsiness, confusion, and finally a deep sleep from which they could not be woken. When Margaret Carwell got back at dusk, she saw that Elizabeth and Thomas were in their beds, not responding but breathing. There was no sign of Sarah. We have put together what happened in the hours that followed from bits and pieces of information. Margaret Carwell called for Dr. Whitfield right away, and he got there just before midnight. At this point, Thomas had stopped breathing. Elizabeth stayed in a coma. People organized a search party to find Sarah, but it was hard for them to see in the dark. Eliza Brown's disappearance at the same time was even more troubling. She wasn't in her room or anywhere else on the plantation grounds. Later, when they searched her small living space, they only found a small, handmade doll made from corn husks, like the ones kids on the plantation made. Dawn showed footprints that went from the main house to the pig pen at the far end of the property. Sheriff Williams' report from October 16th said that the pig pen had been disturbed recently. In a few places, the ground had just been turned over. The animals looked upset and more aggressive than usual. Later that day, when Thaddeus Carwell got back from Savannah, he told the workers to empty the pig pen and dig up the ground. County records describe what they found under the mud and soil in a clinical way. Partial remains that looked like they came from a human, mostly small bones and pieces. The search for Sarah Carwell was officially over, but these remains were never officially identified. Elizabeth Carwell never woke up again. 3 days later, she died. Dr. Whitfield's report said that the cause of death was unknown toxicity that led to organ failure. There was no autopsy on Thomas. His body was buried quickly in the family cemetery with his sister. The search for Eliza Brown that followed went on in Chatham County and nearby counties. Wanted posters called her a murderous Negro woman who was about 36 years old, of average height and build, and had a burned scar on her right hand. They offered $500 to anyone who could find her, dead or alive. There were extensive searches of the Carwell plantation and nearby properties for weeks. Several enslaved people were questioned, often in a brutal way, to find out where Eliza was or what she was planning. County records show that at least 2 people died during these interrogations. None of them gave any helpful information. No one ever found Eliza Brown. The case might have been forgotten, just another dark chapter in the history of the South, if it hadn't been for a discovery made almost 30 years later. Workers found a sealed metal box inside the cornerstone of the old building while building a new county courthouse in Savannah in 1882. There was a handwritten journal inside, and the pages were yellowed but still readable. There was a date on the journal, 1853, and it was signed E.B. At first, county officials thought the journal was a hoax or a piece of fiction. It was put away and forgotten about until historian Miriam Holcomb found it while looking through court records for a different project in 1962. She found a document that was so upsetting that she thought about whether or not to include it in her research. The journal, which was about 30 pages long, told the story of a woman who had been a slave on several plantations in Georgia. The author wrote about the daily humiliations, systematic abuse, and mental toll of being held captive. The most upsetting parts were about her time on a plantation that was never named, but sounded a lot like the Carwell estate. The master beats his own children. One entry read, "Not as he beats us, but with words that cut deeper than any whip. The youngest girl cries at night. I hold her until she sleeps." The boy tries to be like his father, practicing cruelty as though it were a lesson to be learned. The oldest girl watches everything, says nothing. Her eyes grow colder each day. Another entry, dated about 2 weeks before the Carwell children went missing, said, "I found Sarah with welts on her arms today. When I asked who had hurt her, she said it was Thomas, practicing what their father had shown him. When I spoke to Thomas, he said only that Sarah needed to learn her place. He is 9 years old." The last entries get more and more jumbled. There are a lot of references to cleansing and freedom through transformation. The last entry, which is dated October 14, says, "Tomorrow they will be free. We all will." Holcomb's study of county medical records uncovered another troubling fact. Dr. Whitfield had seen Elizabeth Carwell several times in the months before she died for feminine complaints inappropriate to her age. There were no more details given, but Holcomb pointed out that Elizabeth had just turned 12 2 months before she died. After the tragedy, the Carwell plantation went downhill over the next few years. It was unusual and scandalous for that time and place for Thaddeus and Margaret to get a divorce in 1857. Margaret went back to her family in Charleston, where she died in 1862. In 1858, Thaddeus Carwell married again, this time to a woman who was much younger than him. She had 4 more children with him. None of them lived past infancy. As Union troops got closer during the Civil War, the Carwell plantation was deserted. Reports say that Thaddeus Carwell ran away to Texas, where there aren't many records of his life. In 1874, a man who looked like him died in a boarding house in Houston, apparently from drinking too much alcohol. After the war, the land that used to be the Carwell plantation was split up and sold in pieces. In 1879, the main house burned down for no clear reason. According to local legends, the land was cursed and poisoned by what had happened there. Workers found a small metal container about 3 feet below the surface while building a highway that would cut through part of the old plantation grounds in 1958. There was a folded piece of paper and a corn husk doll inside. The paper had a list of names on it. It started with Elizabeth, Thomas, and Sarah Carwell, and went on to list the names of 47 enslaved people who were owned by Thaddeus Carwell at the time of the children's deaths. The last name on the list was Eliza Brown. In the same hand, it said, "Finally free." This discovery brought the case back into the public eye, which is how Holcomb got interested in it years later. Her results were published in a small academic journal in 1964, but not many people paid attention to them. The journal and other papers related to the case were stored at Savannah State University, where they were mostly forgotten. In 1968, a graduate student who was studying farming in the South before the Civil War asked to see the records from the Carwell plantation. The university's archives say that the student looked at a number of documents, such as the EB Journal. 3 days later, the student was no longer on campus. The borrowed books in the journal were never returned. The university's records show that the student is Eliza Blackwell. There has never been any evidence that an Eliza Blackwell went to the university. The Carwell case comes up in Chatham County folklore from time to time, but the details have changed over the years. Some stories say that Eliza poisoned the whole Carwell family. Some people think that Eliza didn't kill the kids, but instead hid them away and raised them in secret until they could escape to the north. Some people say that the pigpen revelation was made up to hide an even worse truth. The one thing that stays the same in these different stories is the description of Eliza Brown, a woman who was pushed beyond her limits and then retaliated in a planned way. Not a monster, but someone who had been systematically dehumanized until she became a monster herself. Thousands of people use the highway that now goes through the old Carwell plantation every day. Not many people know the history of the land they walk on. Even fewer people know about the small, unmarked grave that used to be at the edge of the property. Every year on October 15th, someone puts a corn husk doll there. When workers found bone fragments in the ground in 2004, construction on the highway was temporarily stopped while it was being expanded. Forensic analysis showed that they were pig bones that were about 150 years old. The building work went on. The old pigpen area is now under the eastbound lanes of the highway. Some drivers say that late at night, their car radios suddenly switch to static when they drive over a certain stretch of road. Some people say they can hear what sounds like children's voices through the static. What really went down on the Carwell plantation in October 1853? The partial evidence can be understood in many ways. Did Eliza Brown kill someone because her situation was so bad that she couldn't help herself? Was she a guardian who thought death was the only way to save children who were stuck in a cycle of violence? Or was she something else entirely, not a victim or a villain, but a woman who thought that freedom required the worst sacrifice? County records show that 6 other enslaved people escaped from nearby plantations in the months after the children's deaths. None of them were caught again. Some historians think that Eliza's actions caused these escapes and that her defiance had an effect on the whole region. We still don't know what happened to Eliza Brown. Some people think she got to the north by using the Underground Railroad. Some people think she stayed in Georgia and may have changed her name. Like a lot of this case, the truth is buried under layers of time and intentional secrecy. In 1971, the Savannah Historical Society added the cornhusk doll that had been found in 1958 to its collection. Some parts of the collection were damaged by a fire. The doll was one of the things that were said to have been destroyed. But every year on October 15th, a doll like this one shows up on the unmarked grave at the edge of the old plantation. No one has ever seen who puts it there. Like many other cases from history involving enslaved people, we may never know the whole truth about the tragedy at the Carwell plantation. Someone on purpose destroyed records. People who might have told the truth were forced to stay quiet or were too scared to speak up. What we have left is a shadow story, seen through bits and pieces and whispers. A horrible act that happened because of horrible conditions. Kids who were both victims and perpetrators. And a woman who thought that freedom at any cost was worth any cost. Even when history books don't, the land remembers. And sometimes, late at night, on that stretch of highway, radios pick up more than just static. They hear voices that tell them not to judge, but to just remember. Keep in mind that monsters are made, not born. Keep in mind that the sanitized stories of history hide truths that are too painful to face. Remember Eliza Brown? She fed her master's children to the pigs. Maybe she was feeding something else entirely. A hunger for justice that couldn't be satisfied by half measures. This is not a ghost story after all. There are no ghosts or cursed ground in this story. There is only human cruelty and human resistance going on in the middle of one of America's biggest moral failures. The real horror is not what Eliza Brown may have done, but the system that made it possible for her to do it. The real monsters weren't the pigs that ate people. They were the people who took away other people's lives, dignity, and humanity. And maybe the most disturbing question of all, what would any of us have done if we were in Eliza's shoes? The wooden cross that started this investigation was never seen again after it was logged as evidence. Sheriff's records show that it was kept in the county courthouse, which is where the EB journal would be found years later in the cornerstone. There are some questions that don't have good answers. Some stories don't end, they just keep echoing through time. This is one of those stories. If you drive that stretch of highway outside of Savannah, keep an eye on your radio. Pay attention to the noise. Pay attention to the voices below. They are still there, in the ground, and something is still eating. As part of an oral history project, Professor James Harrington from Emory University talked to older people living in Chatham County in 1965. Ruth Coleman, who was 97 years old at the time, was one of the people who were interviewed. Her grandmother had been a slave on a plantation near the Carwell property. This interview's transcript was put away and mostly forgotten about until 2001. It has an amazing story. Coleman's grandmother told her about a woman named Eliza who worked in the big house on a plantation next door. Coleman remembered that grandmother said this Eliza had lost children of her own, 3 babies who were taken and sold before they could walk. They were sold to different places that were so far away that she knew she would never find them again. Coleman's grandmother said that Eliza would sometimes be seen talking to herself in the kitchen garden, as if her kids were still with her. But she wasn't crazy. Coleman stressed in the interview. Grandmother said she was the only sane person on that whole plantation. She just had a plan that no one else knew about. The Coleman interview is the only place where we know that Eliza Brown had children of her own. This information is not in the Carwell plantation records. If this is true, it makes the tragedy even worse, as it suggests that the woman had already lost the most important thing a parent can lose. In 1997, historian Rebecca Torres did more research and found sales records from Jacob Winters, the person who owned Eliza before her. These records, which are from 1846, show that 3 Negro children, ages 4 years, 2 years, and 8 months, all in good health, were sold. The children are only identified by age, not by their mother. But the timing fits with Eliza's time on the Winters plantation. Torres also found medical records from Dr. Whitfield that said he had treated Eliza for female melancholia soon after she got to the Carwell plantation. Bloodletting and forced labor were common treatments at the time for what we now know as deep grief and trauma. Torres was most upset to find out that Thaddeus Carwell had been writing letters to plantation owners who lived nearby. Carwell wrote in a letter dated April 1852, "The house servant Eliza continues to form inappropriate attachments to my children, particularly the youngest. I have instructed Margaret to monitor her closely and correct any overfamiliarity. We cannot have these people forgetting their place." A responding letter from William Barrett, owner of an adjacent property, advised, "It is a common problem with those who serve in the house. They begin to imagine themselves part of the family. I find a swift return to fieldwork for a season reminds them of their true position." There is no record of Eliza being sent to the fields, which suggests that Carwell still valued her work in the house even though he was worried about her. This contradiction, the simultaneous use of her domestic skills and the cutting off of her human connections, shows how twisted the slave system was. As part of a larger study of antebellum settlements, archaeologist Martin Delaney used ground-penetrating radar to look at the area around the old Carwell plantation in 2008. The survey found something strange about a mile away from the main house site, where there would have been thick woods in the 1,850 seconds. Digging up this strange thing revealed the foundation of a small building that was about 8 feet by 10 feet. Artifacts found at the site included pieces of handmade ceramic pots, a rusty kitchen knife, and a bunch of small bones. At first, the bones were thought to be animal remains, but further study showed that they were a mix of pig and chicken bones with strange cut marks, which suggested that they had been made into crude tools or implements. More importantly, the dig found a small hole in the dirt floor that held a sealed glass jar. The airtight seal kept a folded piece of fabric inside the jar safe. The fabric looked like a nightgown for a little girl. There were 3 sets of initials sewn into the hem with thread that was hard to see: EB, JB, and MB. According to Delaney's report, the structure may have been a temporary shelter that Eliza Brown used after she ran away from the Carwell plantation. The nightgown, which has initials that match her own name and possibly those of her sold children, is a physical link to her past life and lost family. The discovery shows Eliza as more than just a violent person. She was also a mother who thought about her children while she was running for her life. It makes the story more complicated and makes us think about her actions in light of everything she has been through. In 2012, digital restoration of Margaret Carwell's household journal made it possible to read entries that had been too faded to read before. One of these was a disturbing account from July 1853, just 3 months before the children's deaths. Discovered Thomas tormenting one of the kitchen cats today. The poor creature was already dead when I found them. When questioned, he said he was only practicing what father had shown him in the quarters last week. Must speak to Thaddeus about conducting such business away from the house. The boy is too young to witness such things. Another entry from September. Elizabeth has been spending too much time with her father in his study. She comes back with strange ideas about natural hierarchies and divine order. At 12, she should be focusing on her music and needlework, not political philosophy. Thaddeus says I coddle her, and that she needs to understand her place in society as a future mistress. I'm afraid she's learning the wrong things. And most worryingly, an entry from just 2 weeks before the tragedy. Found Sarah crying in the kitchen. Eliza was comforting her. When asked what was wrong, she would not say, only clung tighter to Eliza. Later, Elizabeth told me that Thomas had taken Sarah to the whipping post and made her watch as father punished 2 field hands for not meeting their quota. Sarah has had nightmares since. Eliza makes her favorite dish to help her sleep. I must tell Thaddeus that the children should be kept away from such scenes. These entries imply a home where violence was common and children were being taught the harsh rules of plantation life. They also showed that Eliza had made herself a source of comfort and safety for at least the youngest child, which makes her later actions even more disturbing because it shows how complicated their relationship was. Josephine Wright, a literary scholar, looked at the EB journal found in the courthouse cornerstone in 2015. She didn't focus on what it said, but on how it was written. Her analysis showed that the writer had probably gone to school, which was not common for a slave at that time. The consistent spelling and grammar structures implied that the individual had frequent access to written materials and potentially some formal education. Wright compared the journal to other writings from the same time and place by enslaved and formerly enslaved people that are known. Her conclusion was that the EB journal was similar to writings by educated house servants who had secret access to their owners' libraries. This finding is in line with what people have said about Eliza's role in the Carwell household as a caretaker for the kids. She would probably have been there for their lessons, and she might have learned things that weren't meant for her. This access to information, along with her close knowledge of how the family worked, would have given her skills and insights that many of her enslaved peers did not have. In this case, knowledge was both a tool and a burden for Eliza. It helped her understand the system that oppressed her better, but it didn't give her a way to get away from it. While renovating the Savannah Historical Society building in 2018, workers found a hidden compartment in an old desk that used to belong to Sheriff Williams, the first person to look into the Carwell case. There was a sealed envelope inside that held a single sheet of paper. The document looked like a transcript of an interview with someone named Witness J. It was dated November 1853, about a month after the Carwell children went missing. The transcription reads in part, Witness claims to have encountered a Negro woman matching Eliza Brown's description approximately 14 miles south of the Carwell plantation, traveling alone at night. Witness reports the woman appeared calm, not frightened, and walked with purpose rather than the furtive manner typical of runaways. When questioned about her destination, the woman reportedly said, "I am going to my children." When informed that the Carwell children were dead, the woman smiled and replied, "Not those children. My children. They are waiting for me." Witness further claims the woman showed no signs of remorse or distress when the Carwell tragedy was mentioned. Instead, she reportedly said, "Some chains can only be broken by the most terrible sacrifice. I have made mine. They have made theirs. Now we are all free." Witness reports that upon attempting to apprehend the woman, she produced a small vial from her clothing and threatened to consume its contents if approached. Witness, being alone and unarmed, chose not to pursue further and instead continued to his destination to report the encounter. Sheriff Williams wrote only one note at the bottom of the transcription: "Account deemed unreliable. Witness J, known for fabrication and excessive consumption of spirits." It seems that the interview was never added to the official investigation records. We can't say for sure if this meeting really happened or if it was made up, but it's the only known story of someone who is said to have talked to Eliza Brown after the events at the Carwell plantation. If it's real, it means she was not only alive and free a month after she went missing, but also moving with purpose and confidence. In 2020, genetic testing of soil samples from the old pigpen site found something that wasn't expected. There were small amounts of human DNA mixed in with the pig DNA, which proved that human remains had really rotted in that spot. Even more surprising, the analysis found DNA that was consistent with African ancestry, as well as European markers that are common in the region's white population. This discovery makes it possible that something or someone very bad was buried in the pig pen. Did Eliza get rid of evidence there besides the children's bodies? Or had the site been used for secret burials before October 1853? Death records from the county for the 10 years before the Carwell tragedy show at least 7 enslaved people from the plantation who were listed as deceased. Cause unreported. There is no record of where these people were buried. Many plantations buried enslaved people in unmarked graves on the property, often in places that were not good for other things. Was the pig pen built on top of a graveyard? Or did Eliza choose the place because it was already important as a place of hidden suffering? The genetic evidence can't give us a clear answer to these questions, but it does show that the site had more complicated horrors than even the official investigation found. Layers of tragedy buried in the same soil. In 2022, a relative of Margaret Carwell gave the Georgia Historical Society a collection of family papers. Among these was a previously unknown letter from Margaret to her sister in Charleston, dated December 1853, 2 months after the children's deaths. "I cannot remain in this house any longer. Every corner holds memories that have become unbearable." Thaddeus speaks of replacing the children as though they were livestock lost to disease. He's already made inquiries about suitable matches, though my own grief remains raw. I find myself thinking constantly of Eliza, not with hatred as Thaddeus does, but with a terrible understanding that grows clearer each day. I witnessed what was happening in this house, to those children, to her, to all of them. I witnessed, and I did nothing. Sarah came to me once, not long before it happened. She said, "Mama, Eliza tells me stories about children who escaped to a place where no one can hurt them anymore. I thought it a harmless fancy, a comfort for a sensitive child. Now I understand it was a warning I failed to heed. The truth, dearest sister, is that I do not know if I can condemn Eliza entirely. Even knowing what she did, to do so would require me to believe that what preceded her actions was somehow less monstrous, and I can no longer maintain that illusion. Pray for me, as I can no longer pray for myself. I fear my soul is as lost as those of my children." This letter, which was never sent and seems to have been kept secret for generations, gives us a rare look at how Margaret Carwell felt after the tragedy. It suggests that a woman is starting to doubt the moral foundations of the system she was a part of, even though she is grieving a huge loss. In this way, Eliza's actions changed Margaret as well, forcing her to face truths she had been able to avoid before. It is unclear if this awakening caused her to change her beliefs or actions in any significant way. The historical record only shows that she left the plantation a few months after writing the letter and never came back. There is a strange tradition in Chatham County that started in the early 1900s and is still going on today. Every year on October 15th, some families put their kitchen knives in drawers instead of leaving them on the counter or in blocks. They may not know why they do this. Folklorist Daniel Murphy asked people in the county about this tradition in 2024, and most of them couldn't tell him where it came from. A lot of people said, "It's just what my mama did. Bad luck to leave knives out on that day." But some older residents linked the tradition to that woman who worked in the big house kitchen, even though the real history had changed over time. The practice seems to have started with black families in the area and then spread to the rest of the community over time. The specific meaning of the ritual faded even as it continued. This change from historical trauma to folklore is a kind of cultural memory that lasts longer than conscious memory. Something stays with us long after we've forgotten the details, a behavioral echo of past horrors that lives on in our everyday actions. What should we think about Eliza Brown and the awful things that happened at the Carwell plantation? History does not provide a straightforward moral or a tidy resolution to fulfill our quest for justice or closure. We know that 3 kids died. We know that a woman who had been badly wronged was probably responsible for those deaths. We know that the system that made this tragedy possible went on for years, killing many more people. The most honest conclusion may be this. In a system that dehumanized people deeply, Eliza Brown made a choice to assert her power in the only way she could. This choice, which involved an act of horrific violence, does not reflect her individual morality, but rather the complete lack of moral alternatives within the system that confined her. The real horror of the Carwell plantation tragedy isn't what one desperate woman did. It's the fact that that kind of desperation was intentionally and systematically created throughout an entire society. The evil was not in Eliza Brown, but in the system that made it possible for people to think that feeding children to pigs was a way to free them. In the end, we don't have answers. Only questions that will always be there. What does freedom mean when every way to get there is covered in blood? What obligations do we have regarding inherited systems of oppression as opposed to those we establish? And how do we deal with terrible things that happened in the past that are too painful to think about but too important to forget? Thousands of people travel on the stretch of highway that now covers the old Carwell plantation every day. Most of them don't know what they're driving over. But there is still something that can't be paved over or forgotten, even when the traffic dies down and the modern world gets quiet late at night. Some people say it's just radio interference, a strange shape in the land, or power lines close by. Some people say it's something more. The land itself remembers what happened there, a story that is too horrible to ever completely go away. If you drive that road at night, you might notice that your radio picks up strange signals. Some travelers say they hear what sounds like a woman's voice through the static. It sounds low and determined and is saying what could be names, but they are too faint to make out clearly. It sounds like a roll call or a prayer. And under that voice, which was almost too quiet to hear, there was something else. The sound of kids laughing, not crying or in trouble, but free. The Carwell plantation is no longer there. Its buildings have fallen down. Time and growth have erased its borders. The people who lived and died there, both slaves and slave owners, have long since returned to the earth. But the story lives on, passed down through bits of evidence, oral histories, and the tireless work of those who think that even the most disturbing truths must be kept alive if we are to understand our present. And maybe, in a way that can't be put into words, Eliza Brown is still here, not as a ghost or supernatural being, but as a question that has never been fully answered and a reckoning that has never been finished. She is a murderer and a monster in the official histories, and she did something horrible to innocent children. In counter-narratives, preserved through generations of oral tradition, she is something more complex. A woman who refused to believe that her own children could be taken while she was forced to care for the children of their taker. The truth, as always, is somewhere in the painful space between these two versions. It is the understanding that systems of extreme oppression lead to extreme responses, and that humanity denied will eventually assert itself, sometimes in terrible ways. If you go to Chatham County today and ask about Eliza Brown, not many people will know who she is. But if you ask about the woman who fed her master's kids to the pigs, you might see a flicker of recognition, a nervous glance, or even a gesture to keep bad luck away. Some stories never really go away, even when we try to bury them under highways, progress, and the false sense that the past is really behind us. They stay in the ground. They give food to something that keeps growing. They wait for us to hear them.